Hello, and welcome back to today's American Flyer Trains for the continuation of the rebuild of a train from catalog set 4611, the New York Central Freight Train, which was in the A.C. Gilbert inventory from 1946 to 1947. This is a restoration of a Missouri Pacific stock car, number 629, that was in the A.C. Gilbert inventory from 1946 to 1953 and came in 9 variations. Of course, it would be later superseded by number 929 with centered iron side frames and knuckle couplers. According to Doyle, of the 9 variations of this 629 stock car, this one is a Type 5, the one that we're going to restore, characterized by a die-cast frame, unpainted red plastic, and open slats from the inventory in about 1947, and that should be true of the one that we're in the process of restoring because of these thick shank unweighted couplers as opposed to the thin shank which was characteristic of 1946. This is the same car from my 4611 train set that we're going to be shooting for, and has some of the same characteristics as the one we're going to be restoring in the background. Coloration is pretty much the same. Mine is a little bit lighter. The tone is truer, I think, in the customer's train. They both have the very characteristic roofline warping of these early plastic cars. In addition, warping around the door jamb. Both of these have it in the exact same location. So this is what we're going to be shooting for, is to make it look as close as we can to this. In the video, we're going to be looking at 3 things. I'm going to share 3 things. One is process around plastic warp, which can make it a challenge to separate some of these chassis from bodies on these early cars, either due to rust or glue or just a plain tight fit. So shrinkage, what are my practices for adjusting to that? Another one is we're going to introduce a tool, a snap ring pliers that you see over here to the left. And then a technique that I use for wheel and axle removal, including oil in a journal box. And then I think I said removal, but also installation of wheels and axles. In these early cars, plastic warping is present. Again, you can see it back here in the customer's 629 along the roof line. And it's not exclusive to just these types of cars. This one I mentioned in a previous video is a 630 Reading caboose that has a plastic frame. Don't see these very often. As a matter of fact, red, according to Doyle, might be more rare or scarce than the black plastic. When I started working on this one, and this one belongs to me, it took me probably at least a minimum of an hour to get this frame separated from the body. You can see how tightly fixed it is to the body from just the warping. It seems to wrap it around like a glove. I had to take an X-Acto knife and slowly, very slowly, go down the seam of where the body and the chassis met and separate that 1/8 inch, 1/16 of an inch at a time. Now, yes, is it possible to use brute force to remove these? Yeah, sure. But you're risking either fracturing the body, fracturing the locations where the pins are inserted in the body and the plastic. You don't want to shatter those, or just shattering the frame. Now, I did introduce some additional, in addition to what was there, fractures in this frame, not from rough handling or being overzealous about pulling it out. It's just that it's so brittle. But I inched an X-Acto knife around this thing to get the initial separation, but that still was not enough. I just had to keep touching on it and touching on it and touching on it, putting light pressure until it started to separate. Now, the night before, I dropped penetrating oil on all 4 of the pin locations and along the seam, and that probably helped some, but it still took well over an hour to separate this, and I think over several days. It's not unusual to find that kind of bonding between the body and the chassis, but take it easy on them. When I started on this particular box car or stock car, before I did, I consulted with a restorer friend of mine, somebody who I think is one of the top, if not top, restorer of American Flyer trains in the United States, about the problems with separating these bodies and chassis of this older plastic, which has characteristics of some shrinkage and some warping. He pointed out this car, 652, this series, really, these Pullman coaches. I've got two 652s, a 653 and a 654, and they all had this characteristic. And he pointed back to this as an example. He said it is not unusual to separate these, and they're held on by 6 screws, that is, separating the chassis from the body, held on by 6 screws. And he said then to reattach them and find that the screw openings are not matching nearly as well as they should be, because if it has never been separated and never been worked on, the body may have shrunk faster than the chassis or vice versa, and you find sometimes that they just don't align, and he gave me a heads up warning that that may be the case when I separate these. He also said it may be the case, and he's had experience, where the steps, which are plastic, because this is a plastic chassis, don't match up to the vestibule or door location. And it becomes a challenge then to get the car. He only wanted to cite this as just a really good example of how careful you have to be in separating these. And if the expectation is to get them back together the same way, you might not be able to meet that expectation because of this shrinkage and warpage, and then the misalignment of the screw openings and the shafts that they're going to go into. I had a similar experience of separating this body from this die-cast chassis that I just described, an extremely tight fit over the edge of this chassis. And I had to inch an X-Acto knife, even after applying penetrating oil around the edge and where the pins are, overnight, and still had to spend probably an hour just slowly lifting small sections, inching my way along the edge and pulling up and twisting something I could get between the chassis and the body until I was able to get it up high enough, and eventually was able to grasp the pins in the 4 corners. And it took a while. I took my time because I did not want to risk any kind of fracturing of the body. It's brittle to begin with, it's warped to begin with, and I didn't want to make it any worse. It's also why I decided to leave these door tracks on here during this process, is because they lend some stability to this area right in here, which is very vulnerable to cracking because it's just a thin piece of plastic that attaches these 2 sections of the car body along the bottom. So that took a while, and I guess the best practice then is I use penetrating oil. I use some really sharp instruments to probe between the 2, slowly lifting up and separating, and then exercising a great deal of great deal of patience over several days until I get these separated, not to make them any worse and not to introduce any cracking. Now, that is not going to necessarily make the challenge of putting the chassis back on here go away. We'll just have to see how it goes.